guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's video where I want to talk to you about fat rats. So there seems to be a common trend on the internet at the moment, whether it's with dogs, cats, rats, seals, whatever animal you're thinking of. I guarantee you there's probably an Instagram account dedicated to posting chunky pictures of them, which, as cute as it seems on the surface, when it comes to our own pets, this can have serious health implications and it can also start to reduce their quality of life. So I think it's really important to be self-aware when it comes to our own animals and make sure if they are slightly overweight, we're making those changes to make sure they have the best quality of life possible. So the first thing to consider is whether your rats are actually overweight or not. Now, I do get the odd comment over on TikTok, mostly probably from people that think it's more of an acceptable thing, calling Crumbling Humbug chunky or fat, and I will admit they are slightly on the larger side, but this is mostly to do with their genetics. Both of them come from a line of really big stud rats that are bred to be big and muscly, and when you actually hold them they are quite solid and quite muscly, so that's mostly why they're as big as they are, and rats do have so much variation. Now, rats, just like us, come in a wide variety of different shapes, sizes, weights. They can range anywhere from about 200 grams all the way up to 700, 800 grams, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're overweight. This is mostly based on their genetics. So just as a comparison, these are my two rats. This is Twix and this is Crumble. Now Twix comes from a rescue, but he originates from a backyard breeder breeding rats for pet stores, and as you can see he is absolutely tiny. They both get fed exactly the same thing, but in comparison Twix is tiny compared to Crumble, who comes from a breeder that breeds rats to be big, muscly stud bucks. And that's exactly what you are, just minus the balls. Yes. So yeah, considering they're both fed exactly the same food, it just goes to show that genetics does play a massive part in the size difference because they look like two entirely different species. So for example, you could have a rat that comes from a pet store background and doesn't necessarily have the best genetics. They could weigh about 300 grams. Crumble is drinking, surprise surprise. Crumble, please stop drinking, Mummy has to make videos to make money to feed you. So you could have a rat that weighs about 300 grams from a pet store, doesn't have the best genetics, and then you could also have a rat from a breeder that breeds for muscle mass. These could be about 700 grams, but that doesn't mean this rat is overweight, so weight's not always the best indicator as to whether your rats are fat or not. Obviously their weight does play some part in it, so I do recommend weighing your rats on a regular basis just to check whether it's increased or decreased and keep an eye on it. But the best way to tell if your rat is overweight is by looking at their body condition. So the way you can check your rat's body condition is by holding them up like this, supporting them around the shoulders and looking at this section. You want this to be a tube shape. If they're bulging or it's rounded, then your rat is possibly overweight and you will want to make some changes. So I'll put some pictures of some overweight rats on the screen. If your rats look anywhere similar to this, I do suggest making some lifestyle changes for them. These pictures are just used for educational purposes. I'm not slating anyone who's let their rats get this big, and these are obviously extremes. Rats can be overweight and it's very hard to tell, but these are just some examples of some very chunky, overweight rats that probably need a bit of help with their diet and their exercise. Another way of telling if your rat is overweight is by looking at their movement, whether this is in the cage or outside of the cage. If your rat is running on the floor and their belly is dragging on the ground, this is not a good sign. This is a sign they're overweight and something needs doing about it. Also, you want to look at their movement within the cage. If they're having issues navigating from the top to the bottom or just navigating around the cage in general, and they don't have any age-related health issues, I would be tempted to make some changes just to make sure they can move around a bit easier. So there's a few reasons why your rats might actually be overweight, and the first and most obvious one is their diet. So the first thing to think about is how much you're actually feeding them. With their base mix, you want to aim for about 12 to 15 grams per rat. Obviously this will depend on the individual and it does depend on what kind of food you're feeding them, but as a general guide, 12 to 15 grams per rat. You also want to consider and be careful with how much you're feeding them on top of this. If you're giving them lots and lots of treats on a daily basis, this could also be contributing to their weight. You also want to think about what you're actually feeding them. If you're feeding them a low quality cheap nugget, that's kind of the equivalent of us eating McDonald's every single day, which is obviously not a good thing, compared to making your own mix, which is kind of like a home cooked meal. If you're feeding your rats a low quality food that doesn't really have the best ingredients that's healthy, that's also going to have implications on their weight. So if you're struggling with your rats being a bit overweight, I do recommend also looking at what you're feeding them, and I do have a whole video on rat diet, which I'll leave in the iCards and the description. The last thing to consider when it comes to your rat's diet is how you're actually feeding them. Now, I really don't recommend feeding your rats in a food bowl, and I especially don't recommend keeping this always topped up. This is going to be a surefire way to have fat rats. So I will always recommend just ditching the food bowl, scatter feeding them and hiding the food around the cage instead. Not only does this get your rats moving and more active, which if you have rats that need to lose weight, this will also help them move a bit more, but also it's going to prevent your rats from just sitting around the food bowl and scoffing their face. So if you find your rats tend to just sit around the food bowl and eat all the food really quickly, or if they're stashing their food somewhere else, I highly recommend scatter feeding them or investing in some foraging toys. These are going to encourage your rats to be physically active, but also mentally active too. The next thing to consider that could be causing your rats to be overweight besides their diet is the actual layout of the cage itself. So you want to make sure your cage has an active layout, and by this I mean not cages that are just completely filled with hammocks, or cages that have lots of different levels and shelves that are really easy to get from one another. You don't want things to be too easy for your rats. You want to challenge them a little bit and give them places to climb on and make things a little bit difficult for them. Providing your rats are healthy and they don't have any age-related mobility issues, this should be fairly easy to get your rats to lose weight. Add in things like ropes and ladders and bridges, take out a lot of excess shelves and things like that, and this will make your rats a lot more active in the cage. The last thing to consider that could be contributing towards your rat's weight gain is looking at how much time they spend outside of the cage too. So I do recommend giving your rats at least half an hour to an hour every single day outside of the cage in a safe space, and if you start to slack on this slightly, this could be the reason they've gained weight, and I do recommend trying to increase this. Something else that could also contribute towards your rats suddenly gaining weight is if you've had them neutered or spayed recently. For whatever reason, there has been studies to show that neutered male rats eat a higher percentage of food compared to unneutered rats, and they also have a higher percentage of body fat. So I do recommend if you've had your rats neutered or spayed, or if you're planning on doing it in the future, just keep a little bit of a closer eye on their weight, just because they can be a bit more prone to gaining weight after they've had the surgery. Now, obviously one of the last reasons your rats could actually be overweight is due to an underlying health condition, so I do recommend if you've tried all of the things I'm about to mention and you're still finding they're overweight, I do recommend of course taking them to the vet and discussing your options. But don't despair if you're sat here thinking, oh my gosh, my rat is morbidly obese or my rat is slightly overweight. There's definitely things you can do to help this. Now, the first thing and probably the most obvious solution is to just feed them less. If you're feeding your rats about 15 grams or even about 20 grams of food, try to decrease this slowly to about 12 grams and see if that makes a difference. Now, if you have one rat that seems to be a lot fatter than the others, there always seems to be one, and they seem to be a lot more greedy when it comes to food time, if you're trying to get this particular rat to lose weight, you can either just feed them entirely separately, or you can take them out, put them into a carrier, put the food into the cage, give the other rats about 10 or 15 minutes to eat as much as they want, and then put that rat back in, because obviously by that point the other rats would have had their fill. There'll be so much less food for them to eat and scoff and fill their bellies with. Also, I would recommend being cruel to be kind. If you have a rat that's on a diet and you're trying desperately to get them to lose weight, I do recommend cutting out all treats. Obviously still give them things like vegetables and peas and incorporate this into the diet, but things like store-bought treats, I would just cut out entirely until they've lost the weight. Now, making changes and monitoring their diet is going to have the biggest effect when it comes to their weight, but also you want to make sure they're exercising a bit more too. Now, I do appreciate when it comes to male rats, they can be incredibly lazy sometimes. They don't even want to come out of the cage, they just want to stay in the hammocks, marinate in their own pee and not really exercise. So this can make things a bit tricky when it comes to free roam, and there's definitely a solution to this. So unless you live in a bungalow, you can skip this bit, but I do recommend if you have overweight rats, try to get them to run up and down the stairs. Now, I've done this before, it's quite hilarious to watch. Say for example, if you have your cage upstairs like I do, and your rats aren't really willing to run down the stairs, you can place them at the bottom because they can kind of sense that they're supposed to be upstairs with their cage, and they'll keep trying to run upstairs to get back to the cage. Do this a couple of times a day and it should help them to shed some weight. Failing this, you could also provide them with a wheel inside of the cage. You are going to want to make sure this is big enough, 14 inches or more for females and 16 inches or more for males. Now, females are going to be a lot more likely to use this just because they're not as lazy as males, but it doesn't hurt to also try and provide your males with one too. So those are just some of the reasons why your rats might be overweight and some of the things you can do to help them. Try not to be too discouraged if your rats are slightly overweight. As long as you're making changes and doing things to help them, that's the main thing. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Don't forget to subscribe to see any more animal related videos from me, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys!